Good afternoon, and I'm Chandra De Silva, Interim Provost, and I'd like to welcome you to the last of this semester's Provost Conversations, and I'm sure this is going to be the best because we've had this year discussions about approaches to disciplinary approaches to teaching from a number of different groups. We had history, we had psychology, we had physics, we had management, and we had educational foundations and leadership. And today we have a very special group. These are the people who teach religion in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And let me introduce them briefly. We have Jim Van Doe, lecturer and chief department advisor, who works on the New Testament as literature. And he'll discuss the place of religious studies in philosophy. And then there's Nicole Willem. And I know her a little bit because she studies Tibetan Buddhist culture. And she and I have had a few conversations about that topic. And then there's Scott, who teaches Islam. And he will talk a little bit about how you use Quranic interpretive traditions in the classroom to give ideas about the teaching of religion in the wider context. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I know that they have a they approach this from slightly different points of view. And I think they have some interesting presentations, and I'm sure that you'll have many questions. So who wants to start?
I think I start. So my task was to describe the place of religious studies within the philosophy department at ODU. Other universities might have their own religious studies department, and as I was talking to Janet Katz earlier, there was an attempt for its own major at one point. But we are within another department, which makes us distinct from a lot of the other conversations that happened this semester, as we are just well, this is it, in addition to two adjuncts to the numbers of people who teach religious studies here at Old Dominion. In spring 2016, there are 39 students. This is a little out of date. We've had a number of people signing up, good for us, in the last couple weeks. But it's a small department in general, is the point I was trying to make here. There are 40 or 50, somewhere in there, majors at any time. There are usually about a quarter of those who are religious studies concentration students. So we have a very small pool of students who are dedicated to exclusively religious studies. Certainly not enough that they would fill 3 classes at the upper level every semester just on that alone. There are additionally 15 students currently minoring in religious studies, so we do have another pool to draw from. But in general, the students that we teach in religious studies are not going to be people who are dedicated to religious studies. They're either taking a lower division gen ed class, world religions, with us, or they are taking an upper level class, but they're not intending to get any degree in religion. A lot of them are taking it as an option D. For those who don't know or won't know in the future when this is shown, option D means you're taking 2 classes out of your general discipline in some other discipline to get some breadth of upper level experience. So I think this is true in all of our classes. We get a lot of people taking our classes for option D who have no background whatsoever. So they're taking an upper level course with no lower level preparation at all. And that's one of the problems or one of the issues that we all have to face when we design our classes. Okay. We often also get related fields. Asian studies, I didn't have the Jewish Institute up there. That's another one where we sometimes get some people from related studies, particularly when we do female women in religion classes that we do on a pretty regular basis. As I was saying, for many years, religious studies classes have been offered through the philosophy department. However, it was only in the fall of 1990 that the philosophy department actually changed its name to include religious studies. It used to just be the philosophy department. And every once in a while, people forget us and just call it the philosophy department. Also, with the fall 1990 semester, certain classes were designated as religion classes for the first time. In other words, they didn't satisfy the requirements of philosophy. They were not doing philosophy. And one of the issues over the last 25 years or so has been whether our classes do count towards philosophy or not. Scott is more rigorous in his knowledge of philosophy, and his classes can make the argument better, certainly, than my classes, which are taught from a historical critical perspective rather than a philosophical perspective. So sometimes our classes are cross-categorized. Some are called philosophy, some are called religion. And in fact, this has gone back and forth over the last 25 years. At first, nearly all the religion classes were moved out of philosophy into religion, including the Eastern traditions. Then the Eastern traditions were moved back. Islam disappeared from the catalog entirely for a number of years before popping back up, ironically, in 2000, just as it was about to be needed on the campus. So there was a time when some of these religions were not even taught here because they were intended to be taught in a philosophical manner, and some of these, we just didn't have people in that sort of discipline. Now we have a spectrum of people in the philosophical side and on the religious side. Currently, there are 3 full-time faculty, as you see right here, and 2 adjuncts teaching a philosophy and religious studies department who exclusively teach courses in religious studies. The 2 adjuncts teach upper-level classes often. Rabbi Panitz teaches upper-level classes consistently, and Jeremy Moody has taught an upper-level class for us. Upper-level class courses in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and collectively the Eastern religions are regularly offered. Nicole concentrates in Buddhism. We have had Hinduism offered in the past. And before Nicole, with a previous person, we had Chinese religions taught alongside Japanese religions and comparative religious works. Along with the Philosophy 250E world religions, which lots of students take when they can't get into Intro to Philosophy or Intro to Ethics. No, that's not true. Some of them actually want to take us, but their programs prevent them. A lot of programs are now saying that they have to take Intro to Ethics rather than any of the E classes. So sometimes we don't get as many as want to take our classes, actually. All right. And I think I'm passing it on to Nicole.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and very humbling to be here as well in this series of Provost Conversation Hours, and coming last on the heels of so many great presentations. I've listened to many of them, and some of them really resonated with me, with the flipped classrooms and the quantum physics 360. I was so impressed by that. And so when it comes to talking about religion in this context, I thought, oh, well, what can be the most useful thing for me to talk about? And so I thought about teaching, resources for teaching religion in the field more generally, and talking about one specific technique called mid-range reflection would be some useful things that maybe you can take away in an abstract form or not, or perhaps just pass on this information. One of the things I think that it has already been said in some ways, but I just want to maybe reiterate that, is that religious studies, similar to, I think, gender studies, is inherently interdisciplinary at this stage of the field and the discipline. There was once fields of academic inquiry that were considered absolutely incompatible, such as neuroscience and contemplation, but these are now programs of study at major universities such as Emory and others across the nation. So in other words, the field of interdisciplinary studies is really growing, and religion seems to be a subject matter that just fits well to crossing different approaches. And methodologically, I think all of us draw from just different techniques from the social scientists. I really consider myself a historian, a philologian, and an anthropologist. I've done all 3 of those: translation, field work, and really hard historical primary source material research in Chinese and Tibetan, and and Jim is a textualist as well, and you're a philosopher and a historian, I think, right? If you were to categorize yourself methodologically.
Yeah, and textualist too. You have to wear a lot of hats, as you're saying.
Yeah, but honestly, this is one of the things that I love about religious studies. I love that we can be interdisciplinary and we can draw from this. And we're small. I mean, the field itself is so much bigger than what we represent here. And so I thought I'd introduce a little bit about the American Academy of Religion, which is the main academic body for religious studies, and give you a kind of overview of what this field looks like outside of ODU, and that kind of contrasts and also builds upon what Jim has said, and then Scott will go on to really focus more on the in-classroom scenarios. So. So American Academy of Religion is a huge organization. It has over 9,000 members and is represented by over 900 different institutions across the United States. So it's a very, very large academic body. I think it's really worth reading aloud the statement of purpose in this context so that we can all sort of literally be on the same page, what it's all about, religious studies as a discipline. And that is, one, to promote understanding of and critical reflection of the religious traditions, on religious traditions, issues, questions, values, texts, practices, and institutions. And to this end, we foster communication and exchange among teachers and scholars and the public understanding of religion. And two, to serve the professional interests of members as students, teachers, and scholars. So to foster the professional interests of its members, the AAR also has many different affiliate organizations. One very, very famous example is the Templeton Foundation, which is a philanthropic institute that gives huge prizes of $1.7 million to its recipients. And annually, every year at the AAR, the recipient of that prize gives a speech. And either they're there in person, or frequently they also videotape it and then have that speech in a large lecture hall, often filled with about 700 people in the room. It's incredible. Another affiliate organization that I wanted to talk about at the AR, because I'm directly involved with them, is the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion, which is also just referred to as the Wabash Center. It's funded by the Lilly Foundation, and it was established in 1996 to increase the quality of teaching and learning especially in the fields of theology and religious studies in higher education in America, because there is this thorough study of religious literacy in the United States, and dovetailing on that, it was founded at that point in time. They offer a wide range of programs, from everything from hosting lunches at the AAR, the American Academy of Religion, annual meetings for graduate students. They also have consultation services for doctoral degree programs. For example, at Indiana University, where I did my PhD, I was a part of that doctoral review program with the Wabash Center, and that's how I initially found out about them. They also offer workshops for pre-tenure faculty and colloquiums for mid-career faculty. I've been participating in the workshop for pre-tenure faculty since last year, and one of the main commitments of this workshop is to encourage faculty members to develop lives of scholarship that are enduring and that integrate their teaching and research. How good is that, right? I mean, you can't get, I love that. So these workshops have taken place over this year and a half. The last one is coming up in June. And they help to build a repertoire of techniques just to lead, help, productive lives, and they really emphasize healthy lives. And I think that's also a really great message to get out there, because it's I struggle with this, leading a healthy life as an academic, as a scholar, as a mom, all of these different things that, we balance in our lives. So it's very nice to have that kind of outside support, as well as ODU support, with those kind of balancing of the many hats that we wear. But one of the techniques, which I'll turn to now, that has really helped me in my teaching and just seeing my teaching in a really different way, is this technique of mid-range reflection, which has been developed within the center, the Wabash Center's workshops, but is a technique I think that easily is applicable across disciplines, and therefore that's why I bring it up in this particular context. One of the leading facilitators of the Wabash Center's workshops is Patricia Killen of Gonzaga University, and she describes mid-range reflection as such. Mid-range reflection, and I quote here, mid-range reflection has become the fundamental structure through which faculty participants observe and analyze their pedagogy, their students, and their institutional and guild contexts in a way that invites insight into and refinement of one's teaching craft, end quote. So I think many of us are probably familiar with the technique of reflection in our own classes for students learning, but rarely do we think of this technique as being used to enhance our teaching practices. So drawing upon Killen's article, as well as my own experiences of these Wabash workshops, I wanted to talk about mid-range reflection and one particular example of how I applied this technique in my world religions class. So I'm going to read a little bit closely from my notes here so I don't mess up with the mid-range reflection description here. So mid-range reflection is an example of it is a particular type of reflection, okay? So that involves sitting down and slowing down the meaning-making processes or interpretive processes to look again both at a particular event, such as a teaching moment, right, and also the larger categories. Good, I do have the right slide up there. The larger categories are assumptions or theories that one uses or didn't use to make sense of any particular teaching event, okay? So mid-range reflection refers to the form, resources, and interpretation that make it possible to abstract from this particular teaching moment and in an insightful and flexibly translatable way. I think that's really important. In other words, mid-range reflection is grounded in this insight that bridging this particular and the general is necessary for improving one's own approach to pedagogy and growth in the process of teaching and learning. Okay, so there's no real scripted processes for this, but it does require developing two skills. And I think we do this kind of automatically in some ways when we teach, but I also think having this honed in and really emphasized really helped me to conceptualize this slightly different. And so these two skills are the ability simply to identify this issue, to stand back, identify a moment where you have an effective connection to your teaching. So you go home and you're thinking about a moment. And I'm sure all of us have had that before. I have it almost every day. What happened? Where was that? Okay, so that kind of effective connection. And two, so you recognize that moment. You recognize that teaching moment or that issue. And then two, you have to have the willingness or the ability to design sequences of questions and inquiries and intellectual activities that promote reflection on that particular event. So you have to develop a sort of set of resources that help you play with this, okay, and see it in a new way. And I say play purposely. I think play is a good way to actually analyze teaching moments and see it in different particular ways. Okay, so in order to, okay, so I talked about these different steps and following these different steps, so first identifying this moment, one that has meaning to you, and then two, reflecting on it and developing these analytical tools to look at it from a different perspective. So these are the two basic steps in this process. The second step is one that really requires some thinking and some distance from it, so it's not too emotionally charged. It has to have that kind of intellectual reflection. And then the final process, after you go through these steps, is to integrate this process of mid-range reflection back into your teaching and make tiny, this is the key, tiny cumulative steps to changing teaching practices rather than huge things. It has to just be small. And then these develop over time, and as you develop these sets of skills, they really increase a sort of sense of well-being as a teacher and this sort of clarity of purpose. And this is something that I've experienced from teaching to other mentors who were there in the field. So I wanted to ground this in the particular now so that you guys can get, that's the abstract framework of it. And I'll just talk about now briefly before I wrap up one particular example of this in my world religions class. So when I started the Wabash workshops last year, they asked us about surprise, surprise, what is a particular teaching moment where it didn't work out the way you had planned? Okay, I have to focus on one? Okay, let me think. All right, so I focused on one in particular, and that was in my world religions class in my first semester. I had an assignment called Class Discussion Leader Assignment. And the rationale is I love collaborative learning. I love when students take responsibility for the material themselves. And so they were given the task to present on a topic of their choice within the parameters of world religion, and in particular, the topic for that day. So for example, in the class on Islam, one student presented a presentation on hijab as a fashion statement. I thought it was a great presentation. Another, presented on participation in Ramadan, and they're Christian, but they had a friend who was a Muslim, and their participation in that. So, it was great. The students, led a 5-minute presentation. They got PowerPoints together, and I enjoyed it. It's not that I didn't enjoy it, but when I really reflected on it, that did not meet the whole idea of what I wanted to do with this assignment, which was for them to lead a class discussion. Instead, they were standing up, they were really owning the material and presenting on the material, but they weren't getting the class participating in that moment. So I felt unfulfilled because I wanted them to reach this goal of learning how to communicate with each other, which is something that I feel like the students these days really need work on, asking those open-ended communicative types of questions. So I felt this was a good example of this misfit between what I had intended to teach and what the outcome actually was at the end of the semester. Okay, so I sat back and I presented this moment to my colleagues at the Wabash Center. And then they asked me simple questions, such as, well, what's the purpose? What was the objective of this exercise for you? And then I explained what I just explained to you. But at that moment, before that time, I didn't actually realize what my objective was, right? I didn't realize that my overall objective was really to get them to communicate with each other. Rather, I was getting them to focus on something different. So I had to tweak the assignment. But I realized I didn't have to throw away the assignment because actually, at the end of the semester, I was thinking, oh man, that class discussion leader exercise, maybe I just need to nick it, right? But I was like, no, I kind of like it, but that was the thought that went through my head. And then at the end of these discussions, other colleagues at the Wabash workshop shared their techniques for doing similar exercises as the class discussion leader. And two things really became clear to me after these conversations, and also reading a little bit more on the importance of modeling good teaching practices, especially when it comes to classroom presentations. And so basically what I did is I narrowed down the assignment. So instead of them being able to present on anything within that topic, I said it's a news project now, so religion in the news. And they have to draw from one of these 5 approved websites, and then just a quick, and we make that link available so that everyone in the class can read it before coming to class. And also then they come up with a quick summary of that, and then the main focus is on these open-ended discussion questions. And I work with them at the beginning, modeling what an open-ended question is at the very, very beginning of this. So, how, why, and lifting it up out of the context and making it broader. And so it's this process of identifying that a moment that I felt, this kind of effective investment in what was going on, and then reflecting on it, moving it back, and then just kind of slightly making these incremental changes to my teaching practices. And I'm doing that this semester, and I feel like it's going much better. And then anytime a student starts to ask those really narrow, questions, then I get them to think about, okay, what does an open-ended discussion question look like? And they go back to that, and it seems to be working so far, so good. Knock on wood, right? Okay, so so this is just a technique that I wanted to share. It's a religious studies technique, but it's a technique that I think can cross the disciplines, and it's fun, and it's really helped me. And so that's where I'm going to end today. And I look forward to Scott's.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I forgot to show. Sorry, the last slide. In case this was a whole bunch of resources. I meant to show that before, but there's AAR website. Religion in Public Schools, Wabash Center website, Also really fun, you can take this yourself, is the Pew Research Quiz on Religious Literacy, see how you do. You'd be surprised, it's really amazing. And then on reflective teaching, that's Patricia Killen's article and Wabash Center. Now I can turn it over to Scott, sorry, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that I've been set up nicely here. Jim oriented us towards the place of religious studies here in the Department of Philosophy, but also at ODU. And Nicole helped us understand sort of the discipline broadly, but also theoretical techniques for how we can improve our teaching and just how we can begin to verbalize and articulate our goals for teaching. I'm going to try to walk you through, in a sense, the student's perspective and how I practically apply some of these concepts that Jim and Nicole have outlined for us. So I'm going to look at approaches to the academic study of Islam, but also religion in general. I'll be drawing on both my teaching in Islam as a discipline, which often carries particular controversy in recent history, and then also just generally religion in the academic context can be controversial. So I want to look at both of these. But one of the things that I have to do early in the semester, really the first day of class and repeatedly probably for about the first 2 weeks of class, there's some mention in every class of our methodology. And I remember going to particularly graduate school master's level, but also in undergraduate classes, when professors would do this, I didn't understand why they were doing it. Then I read a lot of medieval Islamic philosophical texts that love to expound methodology very carefully before they tell you anything of interest. And I wanted to find some sort of middle ground. And so one of the things I realized, what I'm really trying to do is help students find the questions that they don't really know that they're asking yet. And also find that point of contact with the study of religion that they may not yet identify. One of the distinctive things about teaching religion is that many people will come in the door with their mind made up about religion in some sense. They're for it, against it generally. They're for one particular strand, but not the others. They're for one particular radical interpretation of a tradition. All sorts of different elements will inform the students' prehistory before they come into the class, and oftentimes that history will, in a sense, shape the questions that they bring and the expectations of what sorts of questions should be answered in an academic class. So I had to work for some time with my first lectures. I just asked people, what is religion? We're studying in this class. What is this? Or I'll start more generally in the Islam class, what is religion, and then move it to what makes Islam distinctive from other religions. But really going at the big concept of what is this category that we study interdisciplinarily in religious studies, because we do use multiple methodologies in the field to study a shared subject. It's, religion, and in my case, Islamic studies as a subfield. So I also want to familiarize them with that approach in the course, that there's methodologies that I'll deploy that are more my expertise, but there are other theoretical approaches and methodologies. And so we have to get at the big question, and we have to get at it in terms that they can make contact with. So one of the first things I ask my students, or I simply declare, is we should never ask in my world religions class, should a person be religious? That may be the question you bring to the class. That may be the question that's informed your engagement with religion up until now. The sort of big philosophical question, should I believe or not? But we're unconcerned with that question. That's never going to be our focus in this course. What we're interested in is simply the fact that people are religious, and understanding what that means in terms of how they experience and express gender, nationality, ethnicity, class, how the experience of history is framed and shaped by different religious worldviews, these sorts of issues. So helping them understand that there's a way to study religion that's not necessarily confessional, that we can freeze that question, or bracket it, if you will, and look at all the other interesting questions that we can ask and answer without being bogged down in this big question. So I say this is the question for your house of worship or your house of non-worship. Wherever it is you feel comfortable expressing whatever degree or lack of religiosity you have, that's where you take that question. But in our course, we're going to be asking these other dimensions of religion. What can we know about them? So the next thing that I find that I have to really work through with my students is understanding how we can get at these various dimensions of religion with an acknowledgement of genuine difference between traditions and genuine difference between participants in the class and their life experience, the differences between theoretical approaches and expertise, and yet that there's also some commonality that's meaningful to observe and to compare, in a sense. So I asked them, ultimately I came up with a few questions that I felt like really framed the issue without necessarily referring to religion. So we could help them bracket this issue and say, we're not talking about religion so much, in terms of should we believe or not. We're talking about some other issue. What is that issue? So this question frames the first element of it for me. And what is the difference between tolerance and indifference? And I actually find this question to be quite productive of student discussion. Usually what I have to do is have the students talk among themselves because this is the first or second day of class. No one really wants to speak out loud, or those 2 or 3 who do want to speak out loud are going to establish that they're the speakers and everyone else will be quiet. So I need to divide them into groups, they talk, and they answer this question, but they don't need to come in as the student who says, I'm not very religious. Or the student who comes in and says, when you ask them to introduce themselves to their companion, they say, this is my name and I am Christian or Buddhist or Muslim. Whatever these identities are, for some people they're deeply held in terms of the identification of their self with a particular tradition, and for others not at all, and that can often create a gulf of communication that they're so habituated to. My friends are not particularly religious people. I don't get religion, or I don't get non-religious people. So we have to come at the issue from another perspective and ask, well, what's the difference between tolerance and indifference? And really getting them to dig into that, and I especially encourage them to use non-religious examples, like what's the difference between being, say, tolerant of diverse sexual identities and indifferent about diverse sexual identities, or tolerant of diverse ethnic and racial identities and indifferent with respect to it, or tolerant about class identities and indifferent with respect to it. And by moving it into these other fields, these other identities, I'm allowed to show the students that we're going to use a methodology. And then we're going to orient that methodology towards religion to see what's distinctive about this field when we wrestle with these issues. For instance, the issue of the difference between tolerance and indifference. I find very succinct slides are the key for this, to give them a simple question that they can debate and then provide their own answers with. And I also mirror this in the first day of class. I frequently just say, what's the thing that you have to have religion? You take it away, you don't have religion. And often God is the most popular first category, but I can point to examples of non-theistic religious traditions. So I'm able to push them, but I don't provide the answer. I just say, well, here's an example that contradicts that point. What's another? Again, trying to get them to speak, but also trying to get them to really question some of the categories that they brought into the classroom about religion. And that's setting them up for the model of the rest of the semester where we're going to explore religion outside of their expectations, hopefully. But also we'll be able to explore religion in terms of their experience. Well, they'll be able to bring some of this theoretical and abstract thinking about a tradition back to their own identity and hopefully critically engage it in some way, be able to articulate their position better if they have a clear position. So I pair this one, though, with sort of the opposite question. After they've expounded to me, and I'm really not looking for a specific answer so much with what's the difference between either of these, bias and commitment, or tolerance and indifference. I don't keep going until a student tells me a particular answer I'm looking for. I keep going until everyone's spoken. And then, usually from those elements, we can put together something that will be useful for us as the semester progresses. So the same thing happens here with commitment versus bias. And I actually find this question to be much more troubling to the students. Indifference they can largely identify as, well, that's not caring. And tolerance is not about not caring. It's about acknowledging actual difference and accepting it. That distinction is not always so succinctly expressed by them, but it's usually in the neighborhood. And the one for bias and commitment is much more difficult, I think, for the students to wrestle with, but it's also one of the ones that's most important in this course because we have to unpack to what extent can you, as a non-religious person, really understand the experience of a devout fundamentalist Christian? Or to what extent can a secular man understand a Muslim woman's experience and the practice of hijab? And I just put that to my students. Again, not with an expectation that one answer is correct and I'll stop when I get it, but I want to hear them all. And typically, again, I'll orient them towards other identities. To what extent can a white male identify with a woman's experience or an African American's experience? And the students will have a wide variety of opinions on that. The important thing is to get them to express their ideas in the class, to realize this is a place that will benefit from their engagement with their ideas, but also they're rethinking their assumptions. And then also to get them to recognize that religious identity is not so alien to other categories that they're used to. So these two questions I find to be particularly productive, just in terms of helping me articulate sort of subversively through their statements the methodology for the course so that we can be very explicit going in. What is it we're doing? Without having to go into a long exposition, sort of Aristotelian type exposition of what the method is. So here I'm asking the question that I just mentioned. Many people will identify with a particular tradition. To what extent can that limit your perspective? If you identify with that tradition, you might feel like you understand it better than anyone else. But sometimes identifying with the tradition obscures your perspective. And so many students will say, no, I mean, if you're a believer, you can't be objective. And then for many of the other students, it's the opposite. If you don't understand belief, you can't be objective. That this is not simply a matter of ideas that are testable, but it's a matter of experience and the construction of meaning. They don't typically use that language, but they're trying to get at this point. And so we have to bring this question to the foreground early so that students become comfortable speaking about it and also realize, yes, it's controversial, but it's manageable. That we can do this and we can practice establishing a respectful dialogue where we genuinely disagree, have different experiences, different expectations, different presumptions, and yet can have meaningful collaborative exchange in the classroom where we learn things from other people's perspectives. And that, I feel like, is really the specter that haunts most of our discussion about religion in the academy. Even for those of you who are not working in religious studies where you go on to this issue so head on, you often may have to touch on religion in the course of some other field, like history, for instance, or political science. And oftentimes the sort of specter that's haunting religious studies is, how do we talk about this controversial subject without offending anyone's identity, giving them the space and comfort to express their identity, but also critically reflect on that. So I find that in addition to these questions, we have to give them space to practice that idea not only with religion, but with other identities. My go-to analogy that has developed from personal reflection and deployment again and again is just Americanness, looking at the Constitution as a sacred text, in a sense, to Americans. It's the text we agree to disagree about. And looking at Americans as an interpretive community that agree to disagree about this text. In a sense, it's authoritative, but not because we all agree on what it means. And this is very parallel, I think, to many religious traditions. You'll have sacred, authoritative texts and interpretive communities. And ritual practices, a variety of things. So specifically, when I teach my course on Islamic traditions, I start by saying we need to understand Islam. After I've done my general introduction of religion, I ask, what do we have to add to this concept of religion to make it Islamic? And I let them speak and reveal whatever information they have, whatever truths they know, whatever prejudices they may have. At this point, the point is not to identify any of those as true or false, but just to, again, make everyone feel comfortable expressing themselves. But ultimately, what I'm looking for is an expression of religion in general, and Islam is that thing that adds the characteristic expression of religion by Muslims. So Muslims are going to express religiosity in terms of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam, the ritual practice of Muslims, and the life of Muhammad and the history of that community. So on my syllabus, but also routinely in the class, including today in my lecture on women in Islam, we return to this principle and say, we need to understand in this course, our objective is not to decide whether someone should be Muslim or not. We're trying to understand Islam is an extended argument among a community about the boundary and meanings of that community. And what they do in the course of that argument is encounter a ritual practice that may be shared or rejected, attenuated, changed, or vigorously preserved. They're going to encounter sacred texts that, again, they'll interact with in different ways. And they'll encounter a sense of community identity, that we are this group as opposed to that group. And so what we're looking to understand as the objective coming out of the class is this idea that we're not going to be able to say definitively what Islam is or isn't, what it should be or what it shouldn't be. What we will set as our goal is understanding how Muslims are debating among themselves about what Islam is and what it isn't, what it has been and what it should be. So we're trying to enter into that argument among the community about the meanings and boundaries of their tradition and understand it. That's the goal of the course. Not necessarily identify the position that's most comfortable for you and leave essentially with your expectations intact. So by bracketing these questions, ultimately what I'm able to do is bring the students into contact with religion outside of, I think, the question that most of us sort of instinctively bring to the discussion of religion, which is, are you or are you not? Why believe? These sorts of questions. And there's a lot that is very helpful to know. For instance, my students routinely express gratitude for learning a variety of nuances about Islam that have nothing to do with whether or not you should be Muslim. They help them understand the world better, but they often tell me they help them understand other categories of identity, like Americanness, nationalism, for instance, but also ethnic and sexual identities. So I find the technique is most useful in that it gives me an opportunity to articulate a specific goal that I have, but I do that by soliciting their responses and then expressing my specific goal. But it also allows me to teach them early on in the course that their experiences and their perspectives are valuable. They just need to be conscious of how they're engaging these and employing them. They're not the only value in our discussion. So they have their place, but they're not the end of the discussion. And that's
The end of this.
the end of my, my discussion. Yeah. I don't think I have anything else yet.
Yeah.
Great. Do you, I don't know, do you guys have any questions?
I can have a comment while the mic is finding. I think I really appreciate Nicole's presentation, in particular the Wabash Center. My wife is a physicist, and people do not walk into her classroom typically convinced that they know what they should think about physics, where they do come into my classroom. So there's a very different dynamic. But another thing that's very different is the field is very conscious of what's effective in terms of pedagogy. There's a whole field of physics education, and it's very carefully and empirically tested what works in the classroom, what doesn't. There's a very conscientious engagement with that, and so I'm really pleased to see institutions like Wabash Center, and American Academy of Religion has long provided a platform for this, but more sort of personal, interactive. You can go to their syllabus site and things like this. But to see more conscious reflection on this, I think, is really valuable for the field, but in particular, I think is really valuable for those of you whose disciplines will occasionally touch on religion, but whose expertise is not in, and whose comfort is not with, talking about religion.
Does anyone have a question?
Or comment, or I don't know, something you want to know more about, or?
I do. I found your presentations fascinating, and I think the question for me is not the distinction between the challenges in teaching a hard science like physics and religion, but whether teaching religion is different from teaching some of the social sciences and humanities, because for many people, religious beliefs are so foundational. Even when you are not a believer, often your ethical values come from some religious tradition or the other, whether you know it or not. So how you discuss something that actually affects your whole upbringing and your fundamental beliefs, and then maybe even try to have people be critical of those beliefs. That's a real challenge, and I wondered whether you had any thoughts about the extent to which teaching of religion and religious studies is different from the other humanities.
I mean, I would just echo some of Scott's observations and what he does. I mean, I think it's very, very important in religious studies classes to set the parameters of what the academic study of religion means. And once you set those parameters, I think then from that it is not about, you know, really exploring one's own individual belief. You come to the classroom with your beliefs, and those are honored. But it's also really important, I think, to establish a very I spend so much time thinking about classroom dynamics, and just like Scott mentioned, to really get each of each person, each student in that class involved in classroom discussions, because that inclusivity is so important. So each person does come to the class with a different set of beliefs. So when you're, depending on what that target area, that subject matter is for the day, that relationship between the subject matter and that person coming at that subject matter can be quite charged sometimes, right? And I have a very diehard atheist in my class this semester, very convinced atheist, and he's very challenging, but he's become really good friends with the Pentecostal in the class. It's really wonderful because I think because there's this dynamic of respect, you can have your beliefs, and these students at ODU, I think, are very aware of diversity. They really respect diversity. And one aspect of diversity, of course, is religious diversity. And so I think, you know, in that framework, when you think about that, and then the other aspect that I consider really important from my background doing Tibetan Buddhism is the integration of culture and religion. So for me, really religious studies is about developing cultural competency. If anything, for me, that's the key. So I say, you know, no matter what your beliefs are, when you come into this class, you live in a global world more than any other previous generation that's been to ODU or anywhere. And you need to be culturally competent. You don't know when you're going to have to go to China tomorrow for your job, or India, or the Middle East. And so even if there's nothing that you take, you know, if you don't remember anything from this class, like specific-wise, the details of anything, I want you to at least take away this idea of competency and that you can educate yourself in that particular culture. And religion is a fundamental aspect of that cultural identity. And so it's from those perspectives. And so is it different from history? Is it different from psychology? Yes and no. I mean, in some ways, you know, you still need to know the stuff. You know, you still need to understand the 5 pillars of Islam. You still need to understand the 4 noble truths. You need to understand, you know, the basic kind of foundations of the different world religions classes. And in that way, I don't think it's any different from history and knowing the facts. But I think it's really, really important to be very careful about the classroom dynamics and involving students and that kind of thing, and perhaps more so than other classes, just because it is a very sensitive and personal issue for some people. So that sensitivity, I think, is just a little bit more heightened. But maybe not so. I mean, gender studies, I would think, also crosses, you know, those boundaries too, some of those courses. So I think it depends on the course, like, you know, and that's what my take. I don't know.
Well, you have to restate propositions that students make a lot.
Yeah.
Because they're coming at it from an aggressive point of view or without the knowledge that they haven't gotten yet. So you have to sort of say, what you mean to say is, or you really want to approach that a different way. I think more so than in a class where you might be talking about 18th century literature, where you won't have someone who comes in, well, Bronte was right and that's the way it should have been done, and, you know. I particularly get, I don't know how much you guys get this, in my Christianity classes, I have a lot of different types of Christians. So whereas Scott might have a Shia and a Sunni and maybe somebody else, I have a Mormon arguing with, well, you said it, a Pentecostal, and Catholics. Catholics were, this semester, very verbal for the first time in my classes, and which is a great thing, but they're also sometimes defensive about the way they're perceived. Mormons, of course, are especially sensitive about the way they're perceived. I have not had a Scientologist yet, so.
Yeah, but I find this to be, I think, probably more acute in dealing with Christian tradition, dealing with Islam in the context of the American Academy in any case. The population of Muslims is actually pretty used to speaking for the tradition and sort of navigating the world of apology and polemic that's out there. So there is more experience with that, whereas I feel like a lot of my Christian students are the ones who are coming in more naive in the sense of not having had to articulate some of the expectations that I'm trying to point out in those first lectures. I think that in some ways there are real challenges to teaching religion because of the foundational identity you mentioned, but I also find it to be really one of the big assets in the class. There are a few courses where people come in with something kind of with skin in the game like that. If you can create the environment where they can feel confident in their identity enough to entertain critical examination, then that's the right balance, I think.
Yeah.
That's very difficult to do, and it doesn't. What works for one student is not going to work for all. It's more art than it is science in that respect. But there are also opportunities that come with teaching religion that are worth observing as well, in particular relative to my wife's position in physics. I can lament that students come with their prejudice about religion to my class, but people also come, with more expectation that what they're going to learn is going to be foundational for their life or something, or more openness to that possibility, whereas someone might just resent having to take intro to physics or something. I do have, of course, plenty of students who tell me that they're in my course because they didn't want to take art history or something. They don't seem to be passionate about the topic so much. But I find that it's the kind of material where people can often find their voice. Even as you mentioned, if they are not themselves religious, oftentimes we'll have students who are aggressively atheist, for instance, who are clearly aggressively atheist in response to a particular tradition. Their conception of being non-religious is very much the shadow of a very particular religion. So that you have to say, oh, well, that issue, considering that to be the essence of religion, is actually quite distinctive of your grandma's faith, instead of, and helping them to understand then that, again, there's more to know than just that you don't believe.
Other thoughts, questions? Comment?
There's a rule that says no two questions come from the same side of the room.
Hi there. I ran a graduate program in England for a long time, and a lot of these discussions that you have with your students would work great for 30-year-old graduate students who are more mature in thought. Do you find it challenging to try to dredge out mature views from 20-year-olds?
Yes. But they're still open and aware, and I think very, some are more mature and some deeper than others, of course, unable to articulate themselves and their feelings. But in general, I think they're at least there and willing to give it a go. And I think with the right prompts, like similar questions that Scott has showed us today between, I think then they can make that leap, but it is about the framing. Framing is really important. How you frame the question, the discussion is extremely important.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I frame it in terms of tolerance and indifference is this that's culturally alive for them, even if they are not invested in a discourse about religion. Many young people are very interested in this and identify themselves in terms of prior generations as being different in this respect. They're trying to articulate, in a sense, their differences. And I think in some respects, again, it can be an asset because some students are coming to college wanting to learn how to articulate these things for themselves. But you're right, there are plenty of others who are coming for other reasons and who you don't easily convince that they will find value in articulating this. But again, the peer influence for both those other things they may be interested in doing and for those things that they can take from the course can be quite profound. So I think that's another reason why getting everyone speaking, creating those small groups where they can practice sharing their ideas with each other before they share them with the group is very important because it helps them realize, oh yeah, that is kind of interesting to me. It's not just this older guy over here talking. And then I think ODU, we are in a fairly distinctive situation. Again, Nicole mentioned the diversity, but because of contact with the military and just non-traditional students, the percentage of the population, I find that I have a fairly diverse group in terms of age and certainly in terms of world experience. A lot of my veterans bring
Yeah, they're great.
a discipline and an experience to the classroom that is incredibly valuable.
But one of the things that just the academy at this point does that it didn't do 30 years ago when I was training is cover some topics that are of more interest to younger people. I certainly didn't learn the sexy stuff that I teach.
Yeah.
The more interesting stuff, child sacrifice. You know, they would never talk about that in my Judaism class 20, 30 years ago. And anthropologically, we're just finding much more interesting stuff than just learning, not that there's anything wrong with it, the Four Noble Truths and the 5 pillars, not learning a list of things, learning, oh, this is actually more relatable to my human experience today than just learning the set of things we are supposed to believe or do.
Yeah, and I find too that this is what they're most suspicious of. Whatever we're sweeping under the rug, you know, that's
Yeah.
when you bring that out into the light, that's when they sort of perk up and
Yeah.
say, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't hear that at Sunday school, or I didn't
Right.
hear that at masjid." So,
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when we get into the new religious movements, that's
Yeah.
next.
Yes, yeah.
They love that, sort of what defines that, so.
Thank you.